Hello, everyone. This is Laura from Victory for Ukraine, where we speak victory over Ukraine and all its people and the soldiers. And we visualize that Ukraine has everything they need to win this war and to take back all their sovereign territory. Victory for Ukraine. And today we're going to speak about the cluster bombs, about what the implications are, why they're necessary, and what the trenches look like, and end up with even some Republican comments about these cluster bombs. What are cluster munitions? Cluster munitions contain multiple explosives that are released over an area of up to the size of several football fields. And this will become apparent why it's necessary, but more on that later. They can be dropped from a plane or launched from the ground or sea. And so here's an interesting tweet from USA Today Graphics showing how cluster bombs work. And of course, they're dropped from aircraft, but they can be fired from ground. The canister opens, releasing the submunitions, and up to 200 bomblets are deployed, each containing highly explosive charge. And each munition breaks into about 300 pieces upon detonation. And these fragments, what makes them really killer is that they have a range of at least 65 feet and have the ability to kill people, disable vehicles, and damage material. But that makes them all the more effective for Ukraine's army. Any real discussion of the cluster munitions has to be precipitated by Putin's 45-mile-long megatrench. The brilliant idea of Putin, what was visible from space as they prepared for the Ukrainian counterattack. And just to give you some example, that was 50 miles behind the Russian front line. So imagine how thick that is. And of course, that was the brilliant idea of Putin to put in something so thick and so large that Ukrainians would have to go through and go through and go through. And the entire front line for Ukraine is approximately 600 miles. And 600 miles is kind of like, it's hard to find out like how wide is that? How long is that? So to give you kind of an example, Texas along the middle is 733 miles wide. And so 733 is just a little bit, 133 miles over of what Ukraine is facing. So imagine all the soldiers, all the trenches, all the obstacles. So that's what the soldiers are up against. And the best way to describe this is their defenses carved into the earth. And I'll pin this article. And so here you see there's at least 5 defensive lines in this case. And there are many, many that we could study. And there's the vehicle obstacles, the trench, the dragon's teeth, and more trenches. And these are such thick fortifications as the Ukrainians go through them. And the land is mined. And remember, Ukraine does not have air superiority. So at any moment, the Ukrainians will be fired on, and it makes it a huge difficulty. And here's another view of looking at a trench, and you can see that there's one line, and then there's an area that's mined, and then another line, and it's just a huge obstacle to send Ukrainian soldiers that could be fired upon and die clearing these trenches. So storming a trench is dangerous business. And so let's accompany these Ukrainian soldiers. They first tried creeping up, setting out at 1 a.m. on May 20th, but the Russians spotted them and opened fire, wounding 4 of the 8 soldiers in the assault group. Then they retreated, dragging their wounded behind them. Rusek, the commander, interviewed at a base well back from the front line where he and the assault group were resting and described that setback. But then they pivoted to trumpet the noisy assault the following morning, and when the Ukrainians deployed their full arsenal, they reclaimed the trench. By the time the Browning stopped, the infantry was at entry to the bunker. And he said, you don't allow the enemy to get oriented, to put his head up and work with grenades. By the time he understands, our guys are in the trenches. At the entry to one bunker, Sergeant Alexander shouted to the Russians, "Come out and you will live." And so there is no question that fighting in trenches is hugely dangerous. It takes tons of ammunition, 3,000 in this one battle, and they don't have air superiority either. And they're going through miles of mines and trenches, and they need our assistance. And that's why I feel that the cluster bomb is the perfect weapon to clear out these trenches and give the Ukrainians a way to break through these defenses. And I'm not the only one that believes so. A top House Republican backs Biden's decision to send cluster munitions to Ukraine, while a prominent Democrat does not. Let's lean in what Chairman McCall has to say.
So let's talk about cluster bombs, because you've been calling for the U.S. government to give cluster bombs to Ukraine for months, and now President Biden has agreed to do so. Canada, Mexico, all of Western Europe, dozens of other countries, in fact, a majority of countries throughout the globe have all banned cluster bombs because they can cause indiscriminate damage. They can kill civilians, especially later if they fail to detonate. The U.S. is still spending millions cleaning up cluster bombs in Laos from the 1960s. Do you have any reservations about giving cluster bombs to Ukraine?
Well, you're right. Geneva Convention, there are signatories to that convention who do not agree with these munitions. We are not a signatory to the Geneva Convention on cluster munitions. Neither is Ukraine. And by the way, Russia is dropping with impunity cluster bombs in Ukraine, in the country of Ukraine right now. All the Ukrainians and Zelensky are asking for is to give them the same weapons the Russians have to use in their own country against Russians who are in their own country. They do not want these to be used in Russia. They want these as self-defense to use against Russians in their own country of Ukraine. I don't see anything wrong with that because, quite honestly, Jake, as you look at the counteroffensive, it's been slowed tremendously because this administration has been so slow to get the weapons in. These weapons would be a game changer. They are highly effective, and particularly hitting flanks of troops inside of Ukraine. They would be a game changer in the counteroffensive, and I'm really pleased the administration has finally agreed to do this. But lastly, ATACMS, my committee, we voted bipartisan to release those ATACMS, longer range artillery that can hit the Iranian drones in Crimea, and also the F-16s need to get in country as soon as possible to deliver the Storm Shadows that the UK has put in there as well. But it'll take a while to train the pilots. But we got to move all this quickly and stop spending so much time.
And time is what we don't have. Let's listen in to Ukrainian retired Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vidman on cluster bombs.
And as you know, and the president acknowledged this, it's a controversial decision. As we mentioned earlier, these weapons contain multiple explosives that are released over an area the size of several football fields. You can have unexploded bomblets in these munitions. What is your sense of it, Colonel Vindman? Is this a good idea?
I think the president is taking a little bit of heat from some corners. I think the progressive wings in particular are, taking a very principled approach. He's likely to take a little bit of heat from elements of NATO also that really can have the leisure to take these kinds of principled approaches. But from a practical standpoint, the president did the right thing, and I support his decision. It was the righteous thing to do. The fact is that these systems are essential to Ukraine in these battles for liberating territory and helping win the war quickly. I met with probably almost a dozen Ukrainian ministers on my trip there. I just got back yesterday. And demining and these kinds of munitions are at the forefront of their minds. Russia has been using these weapon systems with impunity, with a huge amount of duds, meaning unexploded ordnance. Ukraine is going to be very mindful. They're going to take responsibility for their territory. It's being employed on their territory. They're going to be careful with them, but they see it as essential to being able to liberate territory destroy destroy the Russian army. This is all about being able to attack the Russian army at its heart, break its ability to continue to wage war in Ukraine, and with that help usher in the conclusion of the war. In a lot of ways, it seems counterintuitive, but it's frankly one of the most humane things that they could do. Instead of having this war run indefinitely, have a sharp, punctuated conclusion to this war is a pretty humane approach, both for the population that's living under occupation, for the soldiers that are sacrificing their lives to liberate their country, and for all of us that are, assuming enormous amounts of risk with Russia engaging in perpetual war in Ukraine.
I concur with Colonel Vidman. I believe the cluster munitions are the fastest way to clear out the trenches and all the obstacles that are placed in this thick area all along the 600-mile front line. I believe it's the best way to get the Russians out of their territory and the best way to save Ukrainian soldiers' lives. Please like, subscribe, and share. And on the off chance that YouTube does demonetize my videos, please become a patron. I will bring you more in-depth and up-to-the-date knowledge of what's going on in Ukraine. And before we go, I want to give you a great picture I took of Ukrainian children, but here in the U.S. And here are some Ukrainian children here in the U.S. in Ventura County that I found several months ago, that they were marching with their families, trying to call attention to the urgent need for weapons in their country of Ukraine. And they were right here in Ventura County. They made such a huge impression on me. This is Laura signing off from Victory for Ukraine, where I will meet you at the victory party in Kyiv when Ukraine wins this war.